And joining me now from Montreal is Jonah Fried. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances where you're currently, as a representative of a Jewish education and reporting group called CAMRA, involved in trying to prevent the student council from passing policies that would make it very difficult for Jewish students on campus. So why don't you tell us what's the latest? What has just happened in the last couple of days? Just update us.
Sure. Well, first of all, the policy already passed. I would argue that it was illegitimately passed, but it's passed. All the media outlets are reporting that 71% of students voted in favor of the policy. And then if you scroll farther down, perhaps like 4 paragraphs in, they acknowledge that only 2,000 students voted. And that's the critical piece here, right? It was passed. And they're claiming that this is somehow student democracy, when in fact only 2,000 students voted, which is less than 10% of the electorate, mind you. And as I will get into later, this Palestine solidarity policy was marred with various inconsistent electoral bylaw complications. For example, its supporters put up posters that were not approved. There was a judicial board, which is kind of like the student union's Supreme Court. They passed an injunction after I applied for one to prevent the referendum from proceeding because we had, I think, very legitimate legal objections to the policy. Nevertheless, it was reinstated. That's just one example of how this policy was passed in a completely illegitimate fashion.
Just to take a little bit of context, the student council has been, you were on student council for the last couple of years. Are you no longer on council, or you still are?
So I was elected to the Student Society of McGill University, SMU, Student Union Legislative Council in my first year. And I served there until May 2020. After that, I did continue to work in some committees that were part of the SMU, but I was employed as an editor at the McGill Tribune, which is one of the student papers on campus. And I'm no longer there.
You're no longer on. But so basically you're doing now from the outside. Before
Yes.
you were on the inside. What was it like for you when you joined? What was it like as a Jew, to be on that student union?
Well, give you a snapshot. You might have heard of Jordan Wright. She was a student representative my first year. She was on council with me. And my first meeting, the first legislative council session that I went to, which by the way was 8 hours and ended at like 4 a.m., was the one where the student council voted to impeach her because she went on that trip, or she was offered this trip to Israel. So that's how it felt. For a long time, I tried to walk a cautious line between supporting Israel, being the Zionist Jewish person that I am, and trying to fit in, represent what I thought the majority of students wanted. For example, being a student representative, for example, whatever that actually means. Who knows? But also, I could point out certain things about Israel that I disagree with, right? But I would still consider myself a Zionist. And I tried to make that clear to people at McGill who are obviously anti-Zionist to appease them. But the past 2 years have shown me that it simply doesn't work. And the level to which anti-Zionism and criticism of the state of Israel frequently descends into actual outright anti-Semitism at McGill is truly horrendous.
So besides letters and this policy of trying to impeach the student, which we covered at the CJN, the latest is this new policy, which they voted on earlier this semester to have a Palestinian solidarity policy. Just briefly, what does that include?
Yeah. So the most important clause is the creation of a so-called Palestine Solidarity Committee, which would have discretionary power to mobilize students in protests and media advocacy against Israel. And it's important to note that this committee would take representatives exclusively from SPHR, which is Students for Palestinian Human Rights at McGill. That's BDS. They had to rename in 2016 after BDS was ruled unconstitutional, I might emphasize. Yeah, I mean, it's mandated to spew propaganda, and it's the only club of that nature, or I guess not club. Well, SPHR is that club, but it would be the only committee, I should emphasize, like that at SMU. And they're trying to create a false equivalency with the apartheid committee from the 1980s when SMU was at the forefront of advocacy against apartheid South Africa. The problem is that committee was different. It wasn't only from one club. It was elected, didn't have as much oversight, and it had a better mandate. More people wanted it.
Right. Well, the problem that this latest policy, from what I've read, is that it was a very small, number of people who voted. Basically, nobody's paying attention to student council politics on campus, it looks like, because who cares what a bunch of, third and fourth year university students do anyway. But on the other hand, it does have hurtful consequences. And so this is why I assume you are stepping in.
Yeah, I would add that in terms of the way it hurts Jewish students, aside from this committee, which I think is just ludicrous and may even violate Quebec law. The Companies Act, for example, might have an issue with this discretionary committee. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not professing to know what the law is, but that's an idea that people have been, throwing out. But this Palestine solidarity policy also cites these debunked claims that there's a blacklist circulating around that Zionist Jewish students have been compiling for decades and using to, this is a quote, terrorize Palestinian students. They have not provided a shred of evidence. SPHR, again, that BDS club, published a screed online and named several members of the student government, Jewish members mostly, and accused them of this racist, sexist campaign of, collecting Palestinian students' personal information and using it to, like I said, terrorize them, surveil them in cahoots with the McGill administration. It's blood libel, I think. There's no evidence. Both SMU and McGill have done investigations and debunked it. So the fact that it's still out there, the fact that SPHR has not been sanctioned for it is, in my mind, absolutely ridiculous. And it's a part of this policy. It references surveilling of students, protecting Palestinian students from some kind of perceived threat, which is hilarious because the majority of people on SMU clearly support Palestine, as evidenced by the recent policies. They're saying that they're oppressed, and just because they said it, people think it,
Well, the university has come out very strongly in the last couple of weeks saying this is not happening. You guys are wrong. Not you, but this policy has to go. But it comes at a time when the president himself of the student council has been sanctioned and trying to keep his job, and now he's back, and now he isn't back. Student politics is always fraught, and I think at McGill it's more fraughter than most campuses, right? So now there's this whole threat of that this is now somehow anti-democratic. Yeah. I got an email from that was circulating. 100 professors signed this petition. What do you know about that?
Right. Well, I could talk about multiple points there. To your first point about student politics, especially at McGill, being so chaotic. Quebec Law 32, which was passed in the 1980s, renders these political associations, very legitimate entities. They have financial power. They're regulated by the government. And that's something that I think a lot of people, especially American students at McGill, don't realize because it's not present anywhere else. it's a legacy of the Quiet Revolution. It's the reason why the Maple Spring in 2012 was so radical, even so violent. And there was violence. So I think what we're seeing today is the legacy of this radical strain in Quebec student politics, going back to the 1970s and, anti-Vietnam War advocacy. But yeah, I'm a history student, so I have to, get into something that I study a bit. But to your other points, this petition going around that's been signed by professors, I spoke to some of the professors because I'm in some of their classes. Why I asked them why they signed it, especially because I was actually writing a paper related to this broader issue in one of those classes. And the reason in almost every case seems to be this claim that the McGill administration's decision to send that email against the solidarity policy was undemocratic, that it violates SMU's democratic autonomy. Obviously, that's not true. In any democratic system, you need rules, policies that protect minorities. What's special about democracy isn't that the majority always gets what it wants. I mean, that's majoritarianism. That's a demagogocracy, right? A democratic system works because the majority get what they want, but it doesn't hurt those who, are potentially disadvantaged, at least not to a significant degree. You know what I'm saying? And this policy violates that fundamental structure of what a democratic society should look like. And I would also emphasize that McGill's not a democratic society. It's a student. Well, first of all, SMU is a student union. It's a corporation. It just is. If you actually read the Constitution, that's what it is. And then McGill's a university. We're all paying tuition, right? My tuition dollars fund the McGill Daily, even though the McGill Daily is refusing to publish my articles. My articles, which, by the way, I do not think were in any way xenophobic or problematic in any justifiable way to reject it. So it's this distortion of what democracy means that I think is persuading so many professors to sign on to it, aside from those who obviously, oppose Israel for whatever ideological reasons they may have, some of which, they can have their reasons. But the reason that I think is most problematic that I'm hearing is this democracy. And again, like I said earlier, this referendum question should never have gone to the ballot. We followed the correct process and got a injunction against it. The only reason it was put back on the ballot is that SPHR started slandering the elections people online, calling them racist and undemocratic. I can show you screenshots. They pressured the elections people into breaking their own protocols and going against what SMU's own, judicial body said to do. It's pretty ridiculous. And they admitted it themselves in a McGill Tribune article that they wrote. It's like the gloves are off, they're not hiding the fact that they're not following the rules. I mean, they've put up these posters on campus against election rules, and they weren't sanctioned for it, even though we reported it to the elections people. I mean, these are all such overt examples of a failure to follow due process, a failure for SMU to uphold a reasonable and fair election, that this referendum should just be overturned, frankly.
Talk to me a bit about how this has taken over your life and what impact this has had on you.
Yeah, I mean, it has taken over my life in the sense that I'm trying to spearhead the campaign to challenge, contradict these results. I've engaged B'nai B'rith Canada, and with the help of some lawyers who work with them, we're hoping to put legal pressure on the student union, perhaps if necessary. Hopefully they do the right thing and overturn the referendum results. But I also receive research funding from organizations affiliated with SMU for research related to Zionism, related to Israel. So I'm concerned personally, because this policy seems to put the student union at odds with my research. I also feel that as someone who has the experience in SMU and at student publications to understand why this is problematic, I have a certain obligation to step up and fight this. Perhaps it would be easier to just not care and go around McGill like I think 90% of students and not pay attention at all to student politics, but I already made that mistake. I already walked that bridge in my first year and got involved, so here I am. But it's hard to avoid it even if you don't care, because SBHR, that BDS group again, is setting up tables on campus and handing out flyers, calling McGill's decision undemocratic. They're asking people to scan something and it directs you to CJMPE or something. It's Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. And they're putting a lot of pressure, perhaps even legal pressure, I don't really know, on McGill to, uphold this referendum. I mean, McGill's campus has really descended into a proxy war for the Arab-Israeli conflict.
What's the worst thing that somebody's emailed you or said to you or, put on social media about you lately?
Someone posted on one of my articles that I'd posted on social media that I was paid by Israel to write quote unquote xenophobic articles defending them. Which is... So
how do you feel about that? How does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I wish Israel was paying me because I'm a student. I could use the money. But no, in all seriousness, it makes me uncomfortable that people at McGill genuinely think that. I mean, these are people I know, right? And other people liked that comment. I know these people. They know I'm not paid by the state of Israel. And that comment is just obviously anti-Semitic. I mean, it buys into tropes about Jews controlling the media, about, Israel controlling all the Jews of the world as international Zionist cabal. I mean, stuff that, I'm sure these people make fun of QAnon supporters for their conspiratorial theorizing, and yet they can buy into ideas like that or the blacklist and think it's real. So it's deeply unsettling, and I do hope McGill does something to combat this sort of misdirected activism, this thinly veiled anti-Semitism. McGill has established a committee. I was actually just invited by a professor to sit on it to address anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. They emailed all students about it. I'm not entirely sure what this committee is supposed to do, and I would argue that this was already done in 2018 when McGill held a similar convention with representatives from every Jewish group on campus, including Jewish Voices for Peace, and adopted a definition of anti-Semitism for SMU that sounds a lot like the IHRA definition. So the fact that this has not been cited in the years since is, in my mind, absolutely ridiculous.
Do you think that this is an organized effort, and I don't know by whom, but I've talked to students and experts literally for the past 2 years on campuses across Canada to get anti-Israel, pro-BDS, and worse policies adopted. So it sounds like somebody's, telling everybody and sending them literature and helping them funding to do this. I don't know, but that's what it looks like to me. What are your thoughts?
I think it's something of a social movement, There are trending ideas, trending social media posts that all these people are sharing, all these people are reading and circulating. I obviously can't speak to any sort of secret anti-Israel coalition. I think that's potentially buying into the same conspiratorial theorizing. Although I do know that there is some research to suggest that Hamas and certain terrorist groups, promote propaganda that is then shared on American college campuses. But I have no evidence that that's what's going on here. That being said, I follow these people on social media, and it's like any hashtag that goes viral. Whenever Israel does anything in the West Bank, or whenever Israel defends itself from Hamas rockets, it launches a whole wave of anti-Israel activism. I would also point out that it's Apartheid Week right now, and that has a lot to do with this as well. Concordia University passed a policy around the exact same time as McGill did.
How many Jewish students actually and profs are there? Do you know at McGill?
There are 5,000 Jewish students at McGill. It's about 14%. There's a Jewish Studies department. I can't speak to the number of Jewish professors, but there are a lot. Like I said, I get research funding for a project related to Jewish studies. And yesterday I was on the Chabad podcast, actually, similar to this. Jewish life is pretty robust at McGill, notwithstanding all of this anti-Semitism, all of this anti-Zionism.
Well, you said that it's not an anti-Semitic campus. Obviously, that's a large population of Jews. My father went there, my mother went there, my nephews went there, I went there. It has a fraught history. In the 1930s and 40s, there were quotas against Jews at the medical schools and other, professional faculties. Jewish doctors, I've written all about it as well, could not get apprenticeships or internships or residencies. They had to leave until, after the Second World War. So it's not the first rodeo that McGill's had to deal with its tolerance and society's tolerance for Jews. But this one, it's tiring, isn't it? Tiring for you're studying, you're in your final exams, you've got a lot of other things to deal with. And then this happens. And you have to keep fighting this fight. It seems like it's coming back after 75 years,
Yeah, I would point out that the anti-Semitism you're talking about did not evaporate in the 1940s or 50s or 60s. In the 1970s, the North American left split over the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially after the 1967 war. There's a great book by Michael Fischbach, I believe. And I've done a lot of research into McGill's archives, and anti-Semitic tropes were featured in anti-Israel, so-called pro-Palestinian activism on campus for decades. The first apartheid week at McGill featured speakers denouncing Jewish money. So it never went away. I don't think it's coming back per se. I think that now with the Abraham Accords, with increasing normalization with Israel across the Middle East, these anti-Israel groups are becoming more radical, more desperate. They're extremists because they're losing and they know it. BDS has failed.
So if that's the case, why worry about what McGill Student Union cares or says in terms of the policies about speaking against Israel at the moment?
Right. Well, they do have a direct impact on Jewish student life. As you might have seen at U of T, such policies have been used to divest from Hillel or other Jewish groups, kosher food producers, so that's obviously problematic. Speaking for myself, I have research funding that could be jeopardized, and similar concerns about Hillel and Israel on campus, that sort of thing. But as students at a university, I think we have a certain obligation to study things in a critical fashion. And the rhetoric that's going around right now is just so devoid of any critical analysis, facts. False allegations that Israel is an apartheid state, for example. Whether or not you think Israel is committing certain, international humanitarian crimes in the West Bank, it's not apartheid. And the fact that this libel has circulated and is now dominant at McGill is shameful for a world-class university, and it's something that I think students like myself have a duty to fight against. These political debates, these struggles are dynamic parts of university life. I don't think it's ever going to stop. I don't think university life should ever be fixed or stagnant. But when misinformation like this is promoted about the state of Israel, research has shown that it leads to anti-Semitism. Like I revealed with the claim that I am paid by the state of Israel. I could reference other examples too. It does become anti-Semitism. And that's a problem, and that's what we're fighting against.
You have allies.
We do. The McGill administration, like I said, intervened. It's threatened the McGill Student Union with a default, which would basically lead to SMU losing its status as the McGill Undergraduate Student Union. So clearly the McGill administration is, if not on our side, at least upholding our rights, as I think they should. I think that's all they're doing, frankly. They're not coming out on one side or the other. They're simply doing what they have to do. But there are other groups on campus Unfortunately, though, it doesn't look that way if you only read the McGill student papers, because none of them ever consult Jewish students, or if they do, they don't consult Jewish students like me. Like I said, I had an article rejected simply because I referred to certain Palestinian terrorist groups as terrorists. So it's a chilled, even frostbitten speech. And then the Black Student Network, Divest from Fossil Fuels, that's a climate advocacy group on campus. They've all announced like solidarity with SPHR, with the Palestinian cause. So this appropriation of other causes is it's fabricating a moral license, I think, that is very difficult to fight, especially from the outside. It's scary. It does feel like we don't have allies, even though we do.